Hey, Vinny Milkus Outdoors. Today we're not going to talk, well, usually I do like a tip or something, but we're going to talk more about something that's going on. It has to do with, fishing. And there's another one of these things I'm going to get into maybe in a different video that has to do with hunting and just general way of life in a Western state. But here we're going to talk about this in regards to bass. So, um, the headline is Montana wildlife officials warn of invasive smallmouth bass found in northern or north of Yellowstone National Park in the Yellowstone River. If you haven't been, been privy to that article, it's kind of big. I don't know. It's wildlife news there, and there's been two instances where these fish have been or confirmed caught in, north of the park, and I've been kind of battling with some people, and like to me, it's not that big a deal, or it shouldn't be unexpected, to be totally honest. And the Game and Fish Department seemed to be popping smoke, saying that this is just a huge issue. They're asking people to kill these fish that are there. Now, that sounds all good. This say, or, when you first glance, well, they want to save the cutthroat or whatnot. That on face value, if you don't really look into it, it sounds like a reasonable proposition. But we have to look at it a little bit deeper to realize what are we doing all of a sudden now that's going to solve the problem, or if there even is a problem. And I contend that there isn't a problem that hasn't already existed for decades, right? So one, we can go about this a couple different ways. Montana views smallmouth as invasive species, and walleye for that matter. And well, they have native sauger, and which to me have the same predatory characteristics as a walleye. I think they believe pike as a non-native species, but here I can make an argument that there's a possibility that smallmouth are actually could be native there. That's along the lines of them being native in the Missouri River basin that goes all the way up through there, and there's nothing stopping them. Just like as you see here, there's nothing stopping them from traversing the Yellowstone River. Granted, that part of the Yellowstone River. Let's go to this other the real argument. When it's cold, you're not going to have really spawning population of fish that get there, or especially on the smallmouth side. In my contention. Two, they're not don't pose that big a threat, relatively speaking, to the native cutthroat. Here I'll go into this, and you're probably like, "Well, what are you talking about?" They probably, yeah, they do. They're known to eat smaller fish and crayfish or whatnot. But here's the deal: why the sudden is the smallmouth bass a scapegoat for here? Because you know what else exists in that river? It actually is more habitual, more able to live in a cold water environment? Well, one, the walleye, two, the pike. Um, well, just right off the top of my head, there's also a lot of catfish and stuff that can get up there. Ling cod, if you know what those are, they live in that river and they are able to survive in a little bit colder water than traditionally you'd find in smallmouth. So those fish, right? And ling are smart, man, and they're predatory. They'll prey on these fish. So those species right there, and I have caught pike in Montana in one of the best trout in the Bighorn River at the very headwaters of the Bighorn River, where it comes out of an afterbay out of a dam, where it's a blue ribbon trout fishery area right there, and there's northerns right there, and we've caught a little smallmouth. You don't catch a whole bunch of them, but there's northerns, and there's walleye. They're caught there, and northerns are caught quite often. Actually, it's pretty remarkable. But there's still a lot of trout, still a lot of big trout, and more of the trout. When you have ebb and flows in the trout population, there is due to water releases and maybe even regular pressure. There's a lot of pressure there. So if you look at that now, the smallmouth and walleye and catfish are very prolific throughout the big, when you get to the lower runs of the Bighorn and the Little Bighorn into the Yellowstone River and the Mussel Shell too. But the Yellowstone River, once you're around the central part of Montana and east to the eastern part, awesome smallmouth fishing, awesome walleye sauger fishing. Oh yeah, and the saugers also in the Yellowstone River and can make it the same places that these traverse the Yellowstone River as well, and can they eat fish just like the walleye. But anyway, the Yellowstone River is a warm water fishery as you further east you go, and there's still trout there too. But let's take that aside, right? So that's the case that the smallmouth they've been in there for decades, right? like way before I was there, since I was a kid catching smallmouth in that river. I've caught my biggest walleye in the Yellowstone River, like a 10 pounder, like giant fish. I wish I had the pictures. I was seeing this girl, but she had pictures. It was gigantic. I caught it. I was wearing like a white polo shirt, and I caught it on a rattle, like lipless crankbait. I released it back in the thing because it's that I want those fish in that river. To be totally honest, I know that's not the cool thing to say, but that part of the Yellowstone doesn't really sustain a whole lot of trout. It's not conducive to trout fishing anyway. As you go further from to the west, yeah, the cooler waters there tends to be a lot more trout in Yellowstone, and that's just the way the habitat lays out when it comes, especially water temperature wise. But anyway, so if they're so concerned, my other contention is they're so concerned about the cutthroat, especially in the Yellowstone River as you go, and the bull trout. Bull trout's a native species there. Then we ought to look at other fish that tend to either we call compete for habitat, tend to prey on the young, tend to live in the same water conditions as the cutthroat does as well. And there's two that pop right off the top of my head, and that is one, the rainbow trout, which you could say that one loosely, might prey upon small fry and eggs. But the predominant predator that would really affect these native species that they're so concerned about would be the brown trout. But the difference is catering to fly fishermen, these two species bring in a lot of guys. I like catch cutthroat, and I love catch cutthroat. They're beautiful fish, and you got a couple different aspects of having rainbows and browns around them. One, the hybridization between rainbow trout and cutthroat trout. You get cut bows, which I've actually got one on the wall from Colorado, like a mount that I caught with my bare hands. It's noodling of all things. But two, when you have browns around, browns are very. If you haven't caught fish from browns are very predatory fish. They're a trout with a bass nature in a sense, and it's common knowledge for a lot of big brown fishermen. One, they like crawdads just like a smallmouth, but two, they eat small fish. In fact, one of my best lures for catching big browns, here's a little tip, real small jerk baits and spoons. But you take a little jerk bait like you would fish for a bass, just like downsize a little bit, and you go around, and I'll outfish fly fishermen doing that, especially for browns. Browns are very predatorial. But anyway, browns are as notorious too to go into little eddies or whatnot where there are fish spawning, whether that be rainbows, kokanees, and in this case maybe cutthroats. Browns will sit underneath there and eat the eggs, and then also eat smaller trout. So I mean, these browns, which are not native, they're in there and they gorge themselves on this thing, and you get these giant browns, which are fun to catch. So I'm not saying go after browns. I'm just saying the absurdity of picking the smallmouth out of all these species of fish that are actually predatorizing the cutthroat or actually around them. You also can talk about, if you go into the Yellowstone Park, into the lake, the prevalence of lake trout that are in there. Now, that's another species. So, I mean, I know the smallmouth in this case could be a concern, but I don't think they're of such a concern that we need to now start massively killing them. Because if anything, it's just the nature of fish to spread out from a particular body of water. They move and they explore new territory. I don't think they'll, in that area of Montana where that water is that cold, I don't think smallmouth will particularly set up shop as well. Now, not to say they can't, but they typically coexist. There's other places where they've coexisted along with trout. In Arizona, there's the Apache trout and smallmouth coexist in the Black River. And there's browns in there too, and they seem to do all right. The more pressures on those species come from the angler community. They go in there and they actually catch and keep a lot of those fish, so that you have a constant Apache trout stocking. But that's more angler pressure than it is the dynamics of having these other species of fish in there. But then we go to another thing. Well, how do you affect removing a species of fish from a river system that has nothing abridging or nothing stopping them from traversing the waterway, right? Because if you go to like a place, go to the Colorado River, where in western Colorado, they've had a concerted effort to eliminate the channel catfish to save the squawfish or the humpback sucker, whatever it is, and there's political campaigns trying to, show you the angling side of catching that fish, which there isn't. And my family's, been in that valley in western Colorado for like 100 years, and my grandpa grew up fishing there. And you can't see the logic and trying to make it fun to catch humpbacks. It's not fun, right? But anyway, they've attempted to kill the catfish. They've took the limit off of them and tried to poison them in limited quantities. But here's the thing with that. Here's one of those instances. So we can use other states' histories and what they've done to develop. Well, one, they did kind of destroy the entire fishery around the Colorado River there. There's still limited stuff, but two, they wasted a bunch of money, millions of dollars for nothing. And here's why it was nothing. Well, one, the Colorado River, there's until you go up a little bit further north of like Grand Junction into the going towards Denver, there are some roller dams there, and there's some good brown trout and catfish there too, as well. Really big, good catfishing typically. But once you get below the roller dams and where they're killing these fish, there's nothing stopping fish from Lake Powell getting up there. And in fact, I've caught smallmouth in Grand Junction, Colorado, in the Colorado River there, and presumably they would have come up from there. There's been striped bass that have been caught up there. They've been caught, and those definitely come from Lake Powell. There used to be little ponds that had largemouth and sunfish. Those got swept away in floods. They're in the river. There is also, coming from the Gunnison River that goes in there, northern pike, and there's still pike around in those. They're not something you can really typically target, but they're in the river system. And the reason Grand Junction is the name is because of the junction of those rivers. So there's pike in there. But yet I've caught a lot of those squawfish and humpback suckers and whatnot. I've caught them. They're still in there. There's still quite a few of them in there. It's not like they're just completely wiped out. They're not. They coexist with these fish, and they adapt with the rest of them, despite the alarmists. But the other point being is that you can dump as much poison as you want in there. There's still this mechanism of fish to work their way up, and especially like a striped bass that will run the rivers like that, and the trout that live in there as well. So the point being is that it was all for naught because they decided to target one fish that happened to be the shoot du jour of the day, the catfish, and they failed miserably. One, because there's other dynamics. It's more nuanced than just targeting one fish. And two, they didn't, well, I guess that's the same thing. They didn't take into account all these other factors, and they're willing to pour millions of dollars into doing so. So I'm imploring Montana to, not go on a crusade to destroy the smallmouth, who there's a lot of us that love and enjoy, and a lot of kids that enjoy catching smallmouth, especially where they are more prevalent in the Yellowstone. But to just monitor the situation and realize that there's other dynamics in there. If you're going to target one fish, target the fish that poses the most risk at the time, which is definitely not the smallmouth bass. I would argue, if anything, it would be the brown trout in this current circumstance when it comes to predatorization of cutthroat. And if you're looking inside the park, the browns and the Lakers and these other fish that have gone in there are known predators towards other trouts and whatever other little fish are around. But anyway, that's my diatribe for the day, and it just happens to be more West Coast centric or Western centric, just because I happen to get these articles and people talking about it. And at first glance, it sounds awesome because they paint such a black and white picture, and this happens all over the country. Well, especially in the West, where there's this huge environmental type push. And I'm going to talk to you about another instance that doesn't involve fish. It actually involves the hunting side of things, of a similar nature, where the unintended consequences of meddling around with things that we've already affected in the environment, and instead of just learning to coexist with that, and instead we're trying to interject ourselves into the past, I guess, with these kind of policies, and not taking into account the other variables in this situation. But anyway, I hope that the smallmouth will persist there. There's a great smallmouth fishing up there, and maybe in the western part where these trout, I doubt the smallmouth are going to really take to that and displace any kind of trout fishing. In fact, I still catch trout in the lower Yellowstone. When I was a kid, even though there's a lot of smallmouth, and in the Yellowstone Little Bighorn, I will still like sometimes just for fun, we'd take nets and minnow traps and catch whatever we could catch. There's a hodgepodge of different fish species in there. And I've caught bull trout, cutthroats, rainbows, browns. I think I've even caught a brookies in there, of all things, just with a old minnow trap. These fish are in there. I mean, it's just and there's no especially how wild that river. There's no policy, and same with Colorado. There's no policy. There's no way to affect that, and it's just best just to manage the situation at hand, and it's for the betterment of the anglers. I mean, we can all enjoy all these fish because they do coexist. One is not taking over the other. Oh, and the other state that's also done the same thing to bass species is like Oregon, where they've had a perpetual war with the bass in order to save salmon, but there's really more effectors on the salmon population that are, I mean, have greater effect than the smallmouth. But anyway, I want to leave you there. Like, subscribe. Talk to you later. Peace.